The train lurched through the November fog like a wounded beast, its steam whistle crying out across the Appalachian hollows. Silas Thorne sat rigid in the third-class car, watching West Virginia's cold, dark mountains rise through the window like the backs of sleeping giants. His hands rested on his knees, palms down, fingers splayed, a soldier's posture. 5 years since armistice, and his body still didn't know how to be civilian. The other passengers kept their distance, not because he looked dangerous, though the scar running down his left forearm suggested violence, not because he smelled of unwashed wool and cheap tobacco, though he did. They kept away because of his eyes, gray-blue and hollow like windows into an abandoned house. In his coat pocket, folded into a square no bigger than a playing card, was the telegram that had pulled him from a Pittsburgh boarding house 3 weeks prior. Father deceased. Estate requires immediate return. Thornwood Ridge, West Virginia. No signature, no explanation. Just those 9 words that had reached into his aimless drift and yanked him backward into a past he'd spent a decade trying to outrun. Silas hadn't seen his father since he was 8 years old, hadn't heard his voice, hadn't received a letter. Nathaniel Thorne had simply walked out of their Pittsburgh tenement one winter morning in 1903, kissed his wife's forehead, squeezed his son's shoulder, and never returned. No goodbye, no reason, just gone like smoke through a cracked window. His mother had died 7 years later, her lungs eaten by consumption, whispering his father's name in the fever dark. Silas had been 15, alone, angry in a way that had no bottom. The train slowed as it approached Coal Creek Station, a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the mountainside like refugees from a forgotten war. Silas gathered his belongings, one battered leather valise, one haversack from the war. Inside the valise, 3 shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, a razor, a bar of soap wrapped in brown paper, and a bottle of bootleg whiskey he'd been saving for a purpose he couldn't name. Inside the haversack, his service revolver still cleaned and oiled, though he hadn't fired it in 5 years, and a small wooden box he'd found among his mother's things after she died. He'd never opened it, never had the courage. The station platform was empty except for an old man sleeping against a post and a stray dog nosing through trash. Silas stepped down into the cold November air, his breath visible, his boots crunching on coal dust and frozen mud. Above, the sky hung low and colorless, pressing down on the world like a lid. He found a livery stable 2 streets over, run by a gap-toothed man who eyed him with the careful suspicion mountain folk reserved for strangers. Silas paid for a horse and wagon with coins that felt too heavy in his hand. The stableman gave directions without being asked, as if he'd known all along where Silas was headed. Up the ridge road. Follow the creek until it splits. Take the left fork. Keep climbing. You'll know the place when you see it. The road was barely a road, more like a suggestion carved into the mountainside by wagon wheels and erosion. The horse, a gray mare with milky eyes, climbed without complaint, her breath coming in measured clouds. Silas didn't speak to her. Didn't speak at all. The silence felt appropriate, like a vigil. The forest pressed close on both sides, pine and oak, bare-branched and dripping with last night's rain. Everywhere the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves, the smell of things returning to the ground. Silas thought of the trenches in France, mud and blood and the sweet, sick stench of bodies decomposing in no man's land. He closed his eyes, counted to 10 in French the way Thomas had taught him before a shell turned Thomas into red mist and screaming. When he opened his eyes again, he was at the gate. 2 stone pillars covered in ivy and moss marked the entrance to what must have been a century ago a grand approach. Now the iron gate hung crooked on its hinges, rusted open, as if it had given up the pretense of keeping anything out. Beyond it the road continued upward through older trees. Oaks so massive their trunks would take 3 men to encircle, pines tall as cathedral spires. Silas guided the mare through the gate. The air changed, grew heavier, or perhaps lighter. He couldn't tell. It felt like stepping through a curtain into a room where people had just stopped talking. The house revealed itself, slowly emerging from the trees like something surfacing from deep water. Stone. 2 stories. A steep roof of dark slate. windows like eyes that had seen too much and learned to keep secrets. Smoke rose from the chimney, pale against the gray sky. Someone was home. Someone had been expecting him. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop 30 feet from the porch. He sat there, reins loose in his hands, staring at the house that was supposedly his inheritance. His father had lived here, died here, 20 years of absence, and this is what remained. Stone and smoke and silence. 3 women stood on the porch. They didn't wave, didn't call out. They simply stood arranged in a line like sentinels, watching him with an intensity that made the back of his neck prickle. Even from this distance he could see they were tall. Taller than seemed natural for women. Broad-shouldered, still as statues. The one in the center had hair so black it seemed to drink the light. She wore it long and loose despite the cold, and it moved in the breeze like dark water. Her dress was simple gray wool, no decoration. Her hands hung at her sides, calloused and strong. Her face was hard to read. Not young, not old, ageless in the way mountains are ageless. To her right stood a woman with hair the color of wet sand pulled back in a tight bun. Her skin was sun-darkened, her forearms bare despite the November chill, streaked with what looked like fresh dirt. She held a garden spade in one hand, not like a tool but like an extension of her body. The third woman was smaller, younger perhaps, with hair so pale it was almost white. She wore a dress that might have been beautiful once but now hung faded and threadbare. Her eyes were fixed on Silas with an unblinking stare that made him think of owls. Predatory, patient. Silas climbed down from the wagon slowly. His legs felt uncertain beneath him, as if the ground here didn't quite align with the ground everywhere else. He walked toward the porch, each step deliberate. The gravel crunched too loud under his boots. When he reached the bottom step, the dark-haired woman spoke. Her voice was low, textured like wood grain. "We've been keeping the house for you, Mr. Thorne, though we half expected you wouldn't come at all." Silas looked up at her. "How did you know I was coming today?" The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "The land knows before we do." He wanted to ask what that meant, but something in her expression told him the answer wouldn't clarify anything. Instead, he said, "I'm here about my father's estate. The telegram said immediate return." The woman with dirt-streaked arms spoke next. "Your father's been gone 4 weeks now. We buried him proper, under the oak where he asked." Silas felt nothing. No grief, no shock. Just a distant curiosity, like hearing about a stranger's misfortune. "How did he die?" The dark-haired woman's smile faded. "He hanged himself in the horse barn. Cut him down ourselves." The words hung in the cold air between them. Silas's hands curled into fists at his sides, then relaxed. He'd imagined many endings for his father. Disease, accident, old age in some anonymous bed. But not this. Not the rope. The pale-haired woman finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. He tried to leave. They always try to leave. "Who are you?" Silas asked, looking at each of them in turn. The dark-haired woman descended the porch steps with a grace that seemed practiced over decades. She stopped 2 feet from Silas, close enough that he could smell wood smoke and something herbal in her clothes. Lavender, maybe. Or sage. "My name is Lenora Blackwood," she said. "Most call me Nora. This is Edie Moss, and that is Dove Ashford. We are the keepers of Thornwood Ridge. Have been for longer than you've been alive." "Keepers," Silas repeated. Of what Nora's eyes held his. Of what your family promised. Of what you've inherited, whether you want it or not. She turned and walked back up the steps, gesturing for him to follow. Silas hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to get back in the wagon, turn the mare around, ride down the mountain, and never look back. But his legs carried him forward anyway, up the steps, across the porch, through the door that Edie held open with one dirt-smudged hand. The inside of the house smelled like his childhood. Not his real childhood, but some other version. The childhood he might have had if his father hadn't left. Wood smoke and beeswax, dried herbs hanging from ceiling beams, bread baking somewhere deeper in the house. The floors were wide oak planks worn smooth by generations of feet. The walls were whitewashed stone thick enough to hold back winter. A fire burned in a massive hearth, logs crackling and popping. The table was set for four plates, 4 cups, 4 chairs pulled back and waiting as if they'd known the exact moment he would arrive. In the center of the table sat a loaf of bread still steaming, a crock of butter, a pot of honey, apples in a wooden bowl so red they looked like they'd been painted. Nora gestured to the empty chair. "Sit. You must be hungry." Silas didn't sit. He looked around the room searching for something he couldn't name. His father's ghost, maybe. Some evidence of the man who'd left him 2 decades ago. But there was nothing. No photographs, no personal effects. Just the house, solid and eternal and utterly indifferent to human suffering. "Where are his things?" Silas asked. "His clothes, his papers?" "Upstairs," Nora said. "In his room. We haven't touched them. That's for you to do." Silas nodded slowly. "I'll see them now." Edie stepped forward. "Tomorrow. You need to eat first. Sleep. The house will still be here in the morning," I said now. The command in his voice surprised even him. It was the voice he'd used in France when men needed to be told what to do in the 3 seconds before a shell hit. Nora's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Respect, maybe, or recognition. "Follow me," she said. She led him upstairs, her boots heavy on the wooden steps. The second floor was dark, lit only by small windows at each end of the hallway, 4 doors all closed. Nora stopped at the second door on the right. She didn't open it, just stood there, hand on the knob, looking at Silas with an expression he couldn't quite read. "He was a coward," she said quietly, "but he loved you. In his own broken way, he loved you." Then she opened the door and stepped aside. The room was small, sparse, an iron bed frame with a thin mattress, a wooden chair, a desk cluttered with papers, a wardrobe standing open showing 3 shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, a coat. Everything worn, everything gray with age and use. On the desk in the center of the clutter sat a leather-bound book. Silas crossed the room and picked it up. The leather was soft with age, the binding cracked. He opened to the first page. The handwriting was angular, aggressive. His father's hand, though he'd only seen it once on the marriage certificate his mother had kept in a tin box under her bed. Deed of Covenant. Thornwood Ridge established 1823. Every generation 1 son must return. Every generation the land must be fed. I failed. Do not fail as I did. Your father, Nathaniel Thorne. Silas read it twice. 3 times. The words made sense individually, but nonsense as a whole. Covenant. Land must be fed. Failed. "What is this?" he asked, not turning around. Nora stood in the doorway, Edie and Dove flanking her like pale shadows. "The truth," Nora said. "The thing your father could never speak aloud. The thing that killed him." Silas turned to face them. "Explain." Nora entered the room slowly, like someone approaching a wild animal. She sat in the wooden chair, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at Silas with eyes that seemed to hold centuries. "In 1823, your ancestor Jeremiah Thorne bought this land from the government. Bought it cheap because it had just been cleared of Cherokee people, removed, driven west on the Trail of Tears. But 3 women were left behind. 3 women too old or too sick or too stubborn to walk. They stayed. They watched their people disappear over the mountains. And before the last of them died, she made a promise. A curse, if you prefer. She said, this land is sacred. It holds the bones of our children. If you take it, you must feed it. Every generation. 1 son must return. 1 son must give back what was stolen." Silas stared at her. "That's insane." Dove spoke from the doorway, her voice like wind through dead leaves. 7 men have stood where you're standing. 7 men have called it insane. 3 of them died trying to leave. 2 died after they left. 1 became the oak tree outside. Your father became the rope. The room tilted. Silas gripped the edge of the desk to steady himself. "You're saying my father killed himself because of a curse from a dead Cherokee woman 100 years ago." Nora stood. "Not because of the curse, because he couldn't choose. He had a wife in Pittsburgh, a son, but the land called him back. It always calls them back. He tried to have both lives. The land doesn't allow that. She crossed to the wardrobe and pulled out a small wooden box from the top shelf. She placed it on the desk in front of Silas. This was in his hands when we found him, clutched so tight we had to break his fingers to get it loose. Silas looked at the box. It was maybe 6 inches long, 4 inches wide, made of dark wood, polished smooth. No lock, no ornamentation, just a simple box that had once held something important. "Open it," Edie said softly from the door. Silas's hands moved without his permission. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, were 3 things: a lock of hair brown and soft, a child's tooth small and white, and a letter folded into a square yellowed with age. He picked up the letter with shaking hands, unfolded it. The handwriting was different from the covenant book, smaller, more careful. His father's hand again, but younger, gentler. "Silas, if you are reading this, I am already gone. I am a coward. I left you because I couldn't bear to see you become what I became, a prisoner of love I didn't ask for. Your brother was born here. He didn't survive the winter. I couldn't lose you too. Forgive me. Your father, Nathaniel Thorne." The letter slipped from Silas's fingers. Brother. He had a brother. A brother who died before Silas was even born. A brother whose existence his mother had never mentioned, his father had never claimed his entire life had been shaped around the absence of. Nora's voice came from somewhere far away. "We buried him under the oak tree, next to his mother, next to all the others who tried to make this place home and failed. Your father never told us he had another son, never told us he left you behind in Pittsburgh. We thought you were lost, dead maybe, but the land knew. The land always knows." Silas couldn't breathe. The room was too small, the walls too close, the faces of the 3 women too knowing, too patient, too certain of something he couldn't even begin to understand. He pushed past them out the door, down the hallway, down the stairs. His boots thundered on the wood. Behind him no one followed, no one called out. They just let him go as if they'd expected this too. He burst out the front door into the cold November air, ran across the yard toward the tree line. His lungs burned. His heart hammered against his ribs like something trying to escape a cage. And then he saw it. The oak tree. Massive. Ancient. Its trunk wider than a wagon, its branches spreading like the arms of something that had learned to embrace suffering. At its base, barely visible in the gathering dusk, a circle of stones. No marker. No names. Just stones arranged with care, marking the place where bodies had been returned to the earth. Silas fell to his knees in front of the stones. He didn't cry. Hadn't cried since Thomas died in his arms in a French trench, choking on blood and whispering about a wife he'd never see again. But something broke loose inside him, something he'd been carrying since his father left, since his mother died, since the war taught him that survival was just another word for guilt. He knelt there in the dirt, in the cold, in the fading light, and felt the weight of every choice that had led him to this moment. Every wrong turn, every cowardice, every time he'd run instead of stayed. Behind him, soft footsteps. He didn't turn. Edie's voice barely above a whisper. "He's here. Your brother. We don't know his name. Your father never said. But he's here, under the roots, part of the tree now." Silas pressed his palm flat against the cold earth, felt the solid ground beneath. Felt something else, too. A pulse, faint but undeniable, like the heartbeat of something vast and patient and utterly indifferent to his pain. "How long?" he asked. "How long do I have to stay?" Edie knelt beside him close enough that her shoulder almost touched his. 3 seasons, autumn through spring. That's what the covenant requires, and if I leave, her hand covered his on the ground. Warm, calloused, real. Then the land will take what it's owed another way. It always does. They stayed there as darkness fell. 2 people kneeling in the dirt beside a grave no one had named. Above them, the oak tree creaked in the wind. Inside the house, lamplight flickered in the windows. And somewhere deep below, in the roots and stones and ancient memory of the earth, something waited, patient, eternal, hungry for what had been promised 100 years ago. Silas Thorne had come home, whether he wanted to or not. Silas didn't sleep that first night. Couldn't. The guest room they'd given him was clean and spare, with whitewashed walls and a narrow iron bed that creaked at the slightest movement. The mattress smelled of lavender and cedar, as if it had been prepared for him long before he arrived. A single window looked out over the dark forest, and through it he could see the oak tree, a black silhouette against the starless sky. He lay on his back, fully clothed except for his boots staring at the ceiling. Every time he closed his eyes he saw the letter. Your brother was born here. He didn't survive the winter. The words repeated in his mind like a prayer or a curse, impossible to distinguish between the two. At 3 a.m. he gave up the pretense of rest. He rose and moved to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. The world outside was utterly black, the kind of darkness that only existed far from cities, far from civilization. No street lamps, no electric lights, just the vast indifference of night pressing against the glass. Then he saw movement. A figure in the garden below, illuminated by a single lantern. Edie. She was on her knees in what must have been a vegetable patch, pulling weeds by hand despite the hour, despite the cold. Her breath came in visible clouds. Her movements were methodical, almost ritualistic. Pull, toss, move forward. Pull, toss, move forward, as if the work itself was a form of prayer. Silas watched her for 10 minutes. 15. She never looked up, never paused, just worked in the circle of lantern light like the only person left in the world, tending a garden in the middle of the night for reasons he couldn't fathom. Something about the scene held him transfixed, the solitude of it, the quiet devotion. He thought of the trenches again, the men who'd worked through the night, filling sandbags, digging deeper, shoring up walls that would be blown apart by morning. Work as distraction, work as denial, work as the only thing standing between a man and the screaming void. He understood then why she was out there. When dawn finally broke gray and cold, Silas descended the stairs to find the house already alive with quiet industry. Nora sat at the kitchen table reading a book with no title on its spine. Dove stood by the window, motionless as a portrait, staring out at something he couldn't see. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air. Edie stood at the stove, her back to him. She'd changed her dress, but her hands still bore the dirt from her night work ground into the creases of her palms. She didn't turn when he entered, but her shoulders shifted slightly, acknowledging his presence. "Sit," Nora said without looking up from her book. "Food's nearly ready." Silas sat. The chair felt too solid beneath him, as if it had been carved specifically for his weight, his shape, his particular burden. He didn't like it, didn't like how easily this place seemed to accommodate him, as if it had been waiting his entire life for him to arrive and fill this exact space. Edie brought plates to the table, bacon eggs too orange to be natural bread, dark and dense. She set one in front of him without meeting his eyes, then took her own seat across from him. Dove joined them, silently moving like a wraith. Nora closed her book and folded her hands. No one spoke for several minutes, just the sound of forks on plates, the creak of the house settling, wind pressing against the windows. Finally, Silas broke the silence. "I want to see the well." Nora's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She set it down carefully. "Why?" "Because Dove mentioned it yesterday. Said one man became the well itself. I want to understand what that means." Edie's eyes flicked to Nora, some silent communication passing between them. Nora wiped her mouth with a napkin, folded it precisely, and stood. "Finish your breakfast first." "I'm not hungry." "Eat anyway. You'll need your strength." It wasn't a suggestion. Silas ate mechanically, tasting nothing. The eggs were rich and creamy. The bacon was perfectly salted. The bread had a faint sweetness that lingered on his tongue. Food made by hands that knew their work. Food meant to sustain, not merely satisfy. When his plate was empty, Nora gestured for him to follow. She led him through the house to a door he hadn't noticed the night before, half hidden behind a tall cabinet. It opened onto a steep staircase descending into darkness. The air that rose from below was cold and damp, smelling of stone and earth and something older, something mineral. Nora lit a lantern and started down. Silas followed Edie and Dove, falling in behind him like silent witnesses. The stairs were narrow, carved directly into bedrock. Water seeped through cracks in the stone, making the steps slick. Silas counted 23 steps before they reached the bottom. The cellar was larger than he'd expected. A natural cave, it seemed, that had been expanded and shaped by human hands over generations. The walls were rough stone glistening with moisture. The ceiling was low enough that Silas had to duck his head, and in the center of the space, surrounded by a ring of smooth river stones, was the well. It was old, ancient perhaps. The stones that formed its rim were worn almost smooth and covered in markings he couldn't quite make out in the lantern light. Not words, more like symbols, circles within circles, lines that spiraled inward. The well itself was perhaps 4 feet across, its depth impossible to gauge. The water was so still it looked like black glass. Nora set the lantern on a ledge carved into the wall. "This is the heart of Thornwood Ridge. Has been since before your ancestors stole this land, before the Cherokee were forced west, before any white man ever set foot in these mountains. The indigenous people who lived here, they knew this place was sacred. The well goes down deep, deeper than any man has ever measured. It touches something old, something that was here before humans gave it names." Silas approached the well slowly. His reflection appeared in the water, distorted and strange. He looked older than 28, looked tired in a way that went beyond lack of sleep. "What happens if I look into it?" he asked. Dove answered, her voice echoing off the stone. "You see what the land wants you to see. Past, future, truth. Sometimes all at once." Silas knelt beside the rim. The stones were cold beneath his palms. He leaned forward, peering into the depths. For a long moment he saw only his own face staring back. Then the water began to ripple, though no one had touched it. The ripples spread outward in perfect circles, and his reflection shattered into fragments. The fragments rearranged themselves. He was no longer looking at himself. He was looking at a different man, older, with a thick beard and eyes like broken glass. The man wore clothes from another era, a high collar, a dark coat. He was struggling in the water, thrashing his mouth open in a scream Silas couldn't hear. Hands reached down toward him, but they didn't pull him up. They pushed him down, held him under. 3 women stood at the well's edge, their faces obscured by shadow. They watched the man drown with expressions neither cruel nor kind, simply necessary, the way a farmer watches a sick animal put down. The man's struggles weakened, stopped. His body sank into darkness. The water settled. Silas's own reflection returned, shaken and pale. He jerked back from the well, his heart hammering. "What the hell was that?" "Your great-grandfather," Nora said calmly. "Isaiah Thorne. Died in 1879. He tried to destroy the well. Thought if he filled it with stones, broke the connection, the covenant would end. But the land doesn't forgive betrayal. It pulled him in, drowned him. And the women who kept the land in those days, they didn't interfere. Couldn't. The land takes what it takes." Silas stood backing away from the well. His hands were shaking. "You let him die. Not us. We weren't born yet. But our grandmothers, yes. They let him die. Because that's what the covenant demands. Obedience or blood. There's no middle ground." He turned to face them, these 3 women who spoke of drowning and curses and sacred land as if discussing the weather. "You're insane, all of you. This whole place is insane." Edie stepped forward, her expression softer than the others. "We're not asking you to believe, just to stay. 3 seasons. That's all. Winter's coming fast. If you leave before spring, the land will take its due another way." "What way?" She looked at him steadily. "It varies. Sometimes the one who leaves dies on the road. Sometimes everyone they love dies instead. Sometimes they make it years before it catches up. But it always catches up. Your father tried to leave 3 times. Made it as far as Cincinnati twice, Baltimore once. Every time something pulled him back. A feeling, a dream, a letter that shouldn't have existed. And each time he returned he was less himself, more hollow, until there was nothing left but guilt and rope. Silas wanted to run, wanted to bolt up those stairs, saddle the gray mare, ride down the mountain, and never look back. But his legs wouldn't move. His body knew something his mind refused to accept. He was already caught, had been from the moment he read that telegram in Pittsburgh. "Show me his room again," he said quietly. "I need to see something." They climbed back upstairs in silence. The morning light seemed too bright after the darkness below, too ordinary. Nora led him to his father's room and left him there alone, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Silas stood in the center of the room, breathing slowly. Then he began to search. Methodically, carefully. He went through the desk drawers, the wardrobe, under the mattress. Behind the loose board he found near the window. He was looking for something, though he didn't know what. A diary. Another letter. Some explanation that made sense of the senseless. He found it tucked inside a hollowed-out book on the shelf, a leather envelope cracked with age. Inside a single photograph. Daguerreotype by the look of it, from the 1870s, maybe earlier. The photograph showed a boy perhaps 7 years old, dressed in formal Victorian clothes. He stood in front of a stone wall. His hands bandaged his eyes, staring at the camera with an expression far too old for his face. Behind him, barely visible in the faded image, was the well. Silas turned the photograph over. On the back, someone had scratched words into the metal plate with a sharp instrument. "The First Keeper, 1873. May God forgive us." He heard footsteps outside the door. Slow, deliberate. Then a soft knock. "Come in," he said. The door opened. Nora entered, followed by Edie and Dove. They looked at the photograph in his hands, and something passed across Nora's face. Not surprise. Recognition. "You found him," she said. "Who is he?" "The beginning." Dove answered. "The reason the covenant exists, the reason we're here, the reason you're here." Nora moved to the window, staring out at the oak tree. "In 1873, your great-great-grandfather Jeremiah Thorne had been on this land for 50 years. He'd prospered, built this house, cleared fields. But the land wasn't giving the way it used to. Crops failed. Livestock died. He thought it was drought. Bad luck. He didn't understand that the land was hungry. There was a Cherokee woman who lived in the woods then, old, older than anyone could remember. She'd been left behind during the removal, and she'd survived somehow. She came to Jeremiah one night and told him the truth. This land holds bones. Your wealth is built on graves. If you want the land to give, you must give in return. And he did, Silas said, looking at the boy in the photograph. He gave her this child. Not gave, Edie said softly. Offered. The boy was sick. Fever. The old woman said the land could heal him, but only if he was given freely. Jeremiah was desperate. He agreed. They brought the boy to the well, lowered him down. When they pulled him up, he was healed. But he wasn't the same. He'd seen something down there, something that changed him. He lived 3 more years. Nora continued. Never spoke again. Just stared at people with those eyes like he was looking through them at something else. Then one winter night he walked out to the well and jumped in. They found him the next morning. Drowned. And from that day forward the land has required a keeper. One man every generation to remember what was given. To hold the covenant. To feed the land with presence, if not with blood. Silas set the photograph down carefully. And my brother. Was he offered too? Nora turned from the window. Her eyes were wet, though no tears fell. Your brother was born in this house in 1903. Your father was here that winter, one of the times he came back. I loved him. Foolish as that sounds. I thought if I gave him a child he'd stay. But he didn't love me. Not the way the covenant requires. Love freely given. Love that chooses to remain. He stayed out of obligation. Guilt, and the land knew. Knew his heart wasn't in it. The baby was born early, small. He lived 3 weeks. Then one morning I found him cold in his cradle. They say it was winter sickness, but I knew. The land had rejected the offering because the man who made it didn't mean it. She met Silas's eyes. I buried him myself, under the oak. Wouldn't let anyone help. Your father watched from the window up here. He left the next day. Never came back until 10 years later, and by then he was already dying inside. The room felt too small, too full of ghosts. Silas moved to the door, needing air, needing space, but Edie's voice stopped him. I saw you last night, watching from the window. He turned. She stood with her arms crossed, not defensively, but as if holding herself together. Her expression was unreadable. Why do you garden at night? He asked. Because daylight is for the living. Night is for talking to the dead. Who are you talking to? She didn't answer, just held his gaze for a long moment, then looked away. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. I had a child once, before I came here, before I knew this place existed. A man in Baltimore took what wasn't offered, left me with a baby I didn't want and couldn't keep. I tried to love it, tried to see it as anything other than violence made flesh. But I couldn't, and my body knew. At 4 months, I bled, lost it, buried it in a potter's field with no name. She looked back at him, her eyes dry but haunted. I came here to die. Walked up this mountain with a razor and a bottle of laudanum, planning to end it where no one would find me. But Nora found me anyway, pulled the razor out of my hand, made me eat, made me sleep, made me live when I didn't want to. And eventually the wanting to die turned into something else, turned into work, turned into this. She gestured around the room, at the house, at the land beyond. I garden at night because the soil doesn't judge, doesn't ask questions, just takes what I give and turns it into something that can feed people, something useful, something clean. Silas stared at her, saw for the first time the scars on her wrists, faint white lines barely visible but unmistakable. She saw him notice and didn't cover them, just stood there exposed, waiting for judgment that didn't come. I'm sorry, he said. Don't be. I'm not. Not anymore. Silence settled over the room like dust. Outside wind rattled the windows. Somewhere in the house a door creaked, and Silas felt something shift inside him, some small crack in the wall he'd built around himself since the war, since Thomas died whispering apologies, since he'd learned that survival meant carrying the weight of everyone who didn't. He pulled the small wooden box from his coat pocket, the one his mother had left him, the one he'd carried for 13 years without opening. The 3 women watched as he lifted the lid. Inside was a letter, yellowed, folded, addressed to him in his mother's careful handwriting. My dearest Silas, if you are reading this, I am gone. Your father left us not because he stopped loving me, but because he loved someone else, a woman at Thornwood Ridge. He tried to bring me there, but I refused. I was afraid of the mountains, afraid of leaving everything I knew, afraid of a life I couldn't control. He went back alone, and I never forgave him, never tried to understand. I chose my fear over his need, and it destroyed us both. Please forgive him. Forgive me. And if you ever inherit that land, choose differently than we did. Choose presence over fear. Choose staying over running. It's the only way to break what we couldn't. Your loving mother. Silas read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it back in the box. When he looked up, Nora was crying, silent tears running down her face, dripping off her chin. She loved you, Nora whispered. Your mother. He talked about her constantly, talked about you, hated himself for leaving, but he couldn't figure out how to be in both places at once. The land doesn't allow that. It demands all or nothing. What does it demand from me? Silas asked. Nora wiped her face with the back of her hand. 3 seasons. Presence. Connection. Not love if that doesn't come, but witness. The land wants to be seen, known, acknowledged, and in return, it gives life. Abundant life. Look outside. Silas moved to the window. Below the garden where Edie had worked all night was already showing green shoots impossible for November. The trees in the forest seemed fuller, more vibrant than they had yesterday. Even the sky looked different, clearer. When a keeper stays, Nora said, when a man chooses this land freely, everything thrives. But when he resists, when he runs, everything dies. Crops fail, animals sicken, people suffer. The land takes and takes until there's nothing left. And if I stay the 3 seasons, then what I'm free to leave, if you still want to. Most don't. Why not? Because by then the land has become part of them, and they've become part of it, and leaving feels like cutting off a limb. Silas turned from the window. I need time. To think. To decide. You have until first snow, Dove said. After that the land closes, and whatever choice you make, you'll be held to it. How long until first snow? Dove closed her eyes as if listening to something beyond hearing. 3 weeks, maybe 4. Then I have 3 weeks. The women filed out, leaving him alone with his father's ghosts and his mother's letter and the photograph of a boy who'd been sacrificed to something older than names. Silas sat on the edge of the narrow bed. Outside, the afternoon light slanted gold through the trees. Beautiful. Terrible. Indifferent as only nature can be. He thought of Thomas bleeding out in French mud, using his last breath to ask forgiveness for not coming home. He thought of his mother dying alone, whispering his father's name. He thought of the brother he'd never known, cold in a cradle, rejected by land that demanded love be freely given. And he thought of Edie kneeling in dark earth at 3 in the morning, talking to ghosts, choosing work over death, presence over absence. Maybe he thought that's all any of us can do. Stay when staying is hard. Work when work seems pointless. Choose presence when running would be easier. He lay back on the bed, still fully clothed, and closed his eyes. This time sleep came, deep and dreamless as the well, and outside the land waited, patient as stone, hungry as time. Silas woke to the smell of frost and wood smoke. Pale light filtered through the window, the kind of thin November dawn that promised cold and little else. He'd slept 14 hours straight, his body finally claiming the rest it had been denied for weeks. For years, perhaps. He rose and splashed water from the basin on his face. The water was ice cold, shocking him fully awake. In the small mirror above the washstand, his reflection looked more human than it had in days. Still haunted, still carrying weight that didn't show on a scale, but present. Here. Downstairs he found Edie alone in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with steady rhythmic pressure. She glanced up when he entered, nodded once, and returned to her work. No greeting. No questions about how he'd slept, just the quiet acknowledgement of his presence. Coffee, she asked. Please. She gestured toward the pot on the stove with a flour-dusted hand. Cups in the cabinet. Help yourself. Silas poured coffee into a tin cup and sat at the table watching her work. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, folding and pressing, folding and pressing. There was something meditative about it, something that required just enough attention to quiet the mind without demanding so much that thinking became impossible. Where are the others? He asked. Nora's in town, trading vegetables for flour and salt. Dove's in the woods, collecting herbs before the first freeze. You're alone here often. Every Thursday. It's the rhythm we found. Everyone needs solitude sometimes, even in a house of 3. 4 now. Silas said, then immediately regretted it. Edie's hands paused for just a moment, then resumed their work. 4 now, she agreed. Though I don't know for how long. Silas sipped his coffee. It was strong and bitter the way he liked it. The way Thomas had taught him to drink it in France, when weak coffee meant you were too tired to taste the difference, and strong coffee meant you might make it through another day. Can I help with something? He asked. I'm not good at sitting still. Edie studied him, her eyes sharp despite their softness. You know how to split wood? I was raised in the city, but I learned in the army. Firewood detail was better than latrine duty. The barest hint of a smile touched her lips. Shed's out back. Axe is on the wall. Pile needs splitting before snow comes. I'll call you when breakfast is ready. Silas set down his cup and went outside. The morning air bit at his exposed skin, crisp and clean. His breath plumed white. Frost covered everything, turning the world silver and fragile. The shed was a small structure of weathered wood listing slightly to one side, as if it had grown tired of standing straight. Inside, tools hung on the walls with the kind of organization that spoke of long practice. The axe was exactly where Edie said it would be, its handle worn smooth by decades of hands. The woodpile stood behind the shed, a mountain of unsplit rounds. Oak mostly, some pine, the kind of work that would take days to finish properly. Silas set the first round on the splitting block, hefted the axe, and swung. The blade bit deep but didn't split the wood. He'd forgotten to account for the grain. He repositioned, swung again. This time the round split clean down the middle with a satisfying crack. He set the halves aside and reached for another round. The work settled into a rhythm. Lift position, swing, split. Stack. Repeat. His muscles remembered the motion from his army days, from the winter they'd spent in a half-destroyed French village keeping warm on wood they'd scavenged from collapsed houses. He'd split enough wood that winter to build a house. Split it to stay warm, to stay busy, to not think about the men who'd died the week before or the men who'd die the week after. The physical labor felt good, necessary. Each swing of the axe drove something out of him. Frustration, fear, the strange, unsettled feeling that had lived in his chest since he'd arrived at Thornwood Ridge. He worked until his shoulders burned, until sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cold. He didn't hear Edie approach until she was standing 10 feet away, a canteen in her hands. "You'll hurt yourself working that hard without water." He lowered the axe, breathing heavily. "Hadn't realized I was thirsty." She handed him the canteen. He drank deeply. The water was cold and clean, with a mineral taste that suggested it came from a spring, not a well. "You're running," she said. "What? The way you're working. Like you're trying to outpace something." "I know that rhythm. Used to work like that myself." Silas handed back the canteen. "Maybe I am. Can't outrun what's in your head. Believe me, I've tried." He looked at her properly then. In the morning light, she seemed younger than he'd first thought. Maybe 26, maybe 27. Her face was unlined, despite whatever hardships she'd endured. But her eyes were older, ancient almost. "What did you see?" he asked. "In the well, when you first came here." Edie was quiet for a long moment. A bird called from the forest, a harsh cry that echoed off the mountains. Finally she spoke. "I saw myself drowning, not in water, in darkness, going down and down with no bottom in sight. And I thought, good. Let it take me. I've earned it. But then something pulled me back up. Not hands, just a force, like the land itself refusing to let me quit. When I came to, Nora was holding me, and I was angry, furious, because I'd wanted it to end and she'd stolen that from me. How long ago was that? 6 years. November like now. I've lived 6 years I didn't plan on living. And some days I'm grateful. Some days I'm still angry. Most days I don't know which." Silas picked up the axe again, turned it in his hands. The handle was warm from his grip. "I saw a man drown yesterday. In the well. My great-grandfather. The women just watched. We all see death in the well eventually. It shows us what the land has taken, what it will take, what it requires. And what does it require from me?" Edie met his eyes. "That's the question, isn't it? Your father couldn't answer it. Couldn't figure out what the land wanted versus what he wanted. So he gave nothing. And the land took everything." She turned to walk back to the house, then paused. "Breakfast is ready. You should eat before it gets cold." Silas split 3 more rounds, then followed her inside. The kitchen was warm and smelled of bacon and fried potatoes. Nora had returned and sat at the table with a ledger book recording whatever trade she'd made in town. Dove stood by the window, her arms full of plants Silas couldn't name. They ate in relative silence, the kind of quiet that comes from people comfortable with each other's presence. Silas had forgotten what this felt like. In the army, meals were loud with nervous chatter and dark humor. In Pittsburgh, he'd eaten alone in boarding houses where speaking to strangers was considered inappropriate. But this silence was different, intentional, respectful of each person's thoughts. When breakfast was finished, Silas helped clear the plates. Edie washed while he dried another rhythm that required no discussion. Their hands moved around each other with an ease that surprised him. Nora closed her ledger. "Silas, we need to show you something." He set down the dish towel. "What?" "The graves. All of them. You've seen your brother's marker. But there are others. 7 men over 100 years. You should know their stories. Know what you're choosing between." Dove spoke from the window. "The land remembers them. Every one. Even when we forget." They walked into the forest together, the 4 of them following a path that was barely visible beneath fallen leaves. The trees here were old-growth massive oaks and pines that predated the house, predated the covenant, predated everything except the land itself. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in dusty shafts, illuminating the air more than the ground. After 10 minutes of walking, they emerged into a small clearing. The oak tree stood at its center, even more massive up close than it had seemed from the house. Its trunk was easily 15 feet around its bark, thick and deeply furrowed, and at its base, in a careful circle, were the graves. Not just the small ring of stones Silas had seen before. Dozens of markers. Some were rough stones with names carved crudely into their surface. Others were more elaborate wooden crosses that had weathered to gray. One was a small iron fence surrounding a single plot, the metalwork intricate and beautiful despite decades of rust. Nora moved to the first grave, a stone marker with barely legible writing. Jeremiah Thorne, 1803 to 1885. The first. He bought this land and thought he could master it. Learned too late that the land doesn't belong to anyone. We belong to it. She moved to the next. Isaiah Thorne, 1830 to 1879. Your great-grandfather, the one who tried to destroy the well. The land drowned him for it. The third, Marcus Thorne, 1860 to 1904. He accepted the covenant but didn't understand it, thought he could treat it like a business transaction, give the minimum, take the maximum, died of consumption in his 44th year. The land takes slowly when it wants you to understand what you've lost. One by one, Nora recited the names and the stories. 7 men spanning a century. Each one had failed in a different way. One had run and been killed by a falling tree 100 miles away. One had stayed but refused to connect, dying alone and insane. One had loved too many people and been torn apart trying to serve them all. And here Nora said, stopping at a fresh grave with disturbed earth still dark with recent digging, is your father. Nathaniel Thorne, 1870 to 1923. He tried to live 2 lives, succeeded at neither. The land didn't kill him. He killed himself. But it amounts to the same thing. Silas stared at his father's grave. There was no marker yet, just the mounded earth and a simple wooden cross. He felt nothing. No grief, no anger, just a vast emptiness where feeling should have been. What happened to the women, he asked, the ones who loved these men, the ones who were left behind? Edie answered. Some died young, some lived long. All of them suffered. That's what happens when a man can't commit. Everyone suffers. Silas walked to the small iron fence, knelt beside it. The grave it protected was tiny, child-sized. He didn't need to read the marker to know whose it was. My brother, he said. Nora knelt beside him. I named him Samuel, after your father. He never knew. Left before I could tell him, before the baby even showed. And when I lost him, I thought, this is punishment, for loving a man who couldn't love me back, for trying to force a covenant instead of letting it grow naturally. She reached out and touched the cold iron. I come here every morning, talk to him, tell him about the weather, the garden, the small things that make up a day. He never knew language, never knew the world, but I tell him anyway, because he deserves to be remembered, and because remembering is the only gift I have left to give. Silas looked at her, saw the grief carved into the lines around her eyes, the set of her mouth. This woman had loved his father, had borne his child, had buried that child alone, and she'd stayed in this place that had taken everything from her, stayed because someone had to keep the covenant, stayed because running would only make the suffering spread. I'm sorry, he said. Don't be sorry. Just understand. The covenant isn't about blood or sacrifice or ancient magic. It's simpler than that. It's about presence. about choosing to stay when leaving would be easier, about working the land, knowing the land, being part of the land instead of trying to own it. Your ancestors never understood that. They thought they could take without giving, use without being used, and the land taught them otherwise, one death at a time. Dove had moved to the edge of the clearing. She stood perfectly still, her head tilted as if listening to something beyond human hearing. Then she spoke, her voice carrying clearly despite not being raised. "Someone's coming." They all turned. Through the trees Silas could hear it now. Footsteps. Heavy. Uneven. The crack of branches underfoot. A man's voice cursing softly. A figure emerged into the clearing. Old, maybe 70, with a face like weathered leather and eyes sharp as broken glass. He wore overalls and a heavy coat, carried a walking stick that looked more like a weapon. He stopped when he saw them, his gaze moving from face to face before settling on Silas. "So," he said. The new one finally arrived. Nora stood. "Elijah, you're trespassing." The old man snorted. "Been walking these woods since before you were born, girl. Ain't trespassing to visit graves. You're not here to visit graves. You're here to satisfy your curiosity." "Damn right I am. Whole valley's been talking. Nathaniel's boy from the city, come to claim his inheritance. Come to see if he's fool enough to stay." Silas stood slowly, meeting the old man's gaze. "And what's it to you?" Elijah laughed to sound like rocks tumbling down a hill. "Everything, boy. I live 2 ridges over. Been watching Thornwood Ridge for 50 years. Watched your grandfather die. Watched your father try to run and come crawling back. Watched good men get chewed up by this land's hunger. So yeah, it's something to me." He stepped closer, leaning on his walking stick. "You know what your problem is? All you Thorn men. You think you're special. Think the rules don't apply. Think you can negotiate with something that existed before words did. But the land don't negotiate. It demands. And you either give what it wants, or it takes what it needs." Silas held his ground. "And what does it want from me?" The old man's eyes narrowed. "Same thing it's always wanted. A keeper who means it. Who stays because they choose to, not because they're trapped. Who works the land like a partner instead of a possession. Your father couldn't do it. Too much city in him. Too much pride. But you—" He paused, studying Silas with uncomfortable intensity. "You got something different in your eyes. Something broken that wants to heal." "I'm not broken." Elijah laughed again. "Boy, we're all broken. Question is whether you're broken in a way the land can use. Broken like Edie here, who came to die and chose to live. Broken like Nora, who lost everything and stayed anyway. Or broken like your father, who couldn't choose anything and lost himself trying." He turned and began walking back toward the trees. Then he stopped, called over his shoulder. "First snow's coming Friday. 3 days. After that the land closes. Whatever you are when the snow falls, that's what you'll become spring. Choose wisely." And he was gone, disappearing into the forest, like smoke. The 4 of them stood in silence for a long moment. Finally Silas spoke. 3 days. Nora nodded. "He's right. I can feel it. The temperature's dropping faster than it should. The animals are moving to lower ground. The land knows." "What happens if I'm still deciding when the snow comes?" Dove answered, her voice distant. "Then the land decides for you, and the land is not kind to the uncertain." They walked back to the house without speaking. Silas felt the weight of every grave they'd left behind, every failed attempt at covenant, every man who'd stood where he stood now and made the wrong choice. Or maybe there were no right choices. Maybe there was only staying or leaving, and both led to their own kind of death. That night Silas couldn't sleep again. He lay in the narrow bed, listening to the house settle around him, footsteps on the floor above, the distant sound of someone crying so soft he might have imagined it, wind pressing against the windows like something trying to get in. At midnight he gave up and went downstairs, found Nora in the kitchen sitting at the table with a cup of tea and a book. She looked up when he entered but didn't seem surprised. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Seems to be a pattern." She pushed out the chair across from her with her foot. "Sit. I'll make you tea." I don't like tea. Then sit in silence. Company's the same either way. He sat. Nora poured hot water from the kettle into a second cup, added leaves from a tin. The smell was herbal unfamiliar, not unpleasant. "What are you reading?" he asked. She turned the book so he could see the spine. "No title, just blank leather." "I'm not reading. I'm writing." "What?" "A record. Every keeper who's come here, every choice they made, every consequence. Someone needs to remember. Dove remembers in her bones, in her blood. But I remember in words. So that someday maybe one of you will read this and understand before it's too late. Has anyone ever understood?" "Not yet. But I keep hoping." They sat in silence while the tea steeped. Outside an owl called. Somewhere in the house a clock ticked, though Silas hadn't seen a clock. Nora pushed the cup toward him. "Drink. It'll help you sleep." "What's in it, Valerian?" "Chamomile." "Other things?" "Nothing harmful. Just peaceful." He drank. It was bitter, but not unpleasantly so. Warmth spread through his chest down into his limbs. His shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask anything. Why do you stay?" "Really? Not because of the covenant or the land or the graves. Why do you, Lenora Blackwood, choose to be here?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, "Because I tried leaving once, made it all the way to Charleston, got a job in a hotel, wore a uniform, served breakfast to people who'd never known hunger. And every night I'd dream of this place, the smell of pine, the sound of wind through the oak, Edie's hands in the dirt, Dove's silence, the weight of responsibility, and I'd wake up crying because I'd traded something real for something easy." She met his eyes. "I came back because this is the only place I've ever belonged. The only place that requires all of me, not just the presentable parts. The land is hard, unforgiving. But it's honest. And after a lifetime of lies, people telling me I should want different things, be different things, honest feels like home." Silas finished the tea. His eyelids were heavy now. The edges of the room had gone soft. 3 days, he said. 3 days, Nora agreed. But tonight is tonight. Sleep now. Tomorrow will demand enough. He climbed the stairs, feeling the weight of the house around him, the weight of all the men who'd walked these stairs before him, the weight of choices unmade and consequences waiting. In his room, he went to the window one last time, looked out at the oak tree black against the starlit sky, and beneath it, those small markers, 7 men who'd failed, 1 infant who'd never had a chance. He thought of Thomas dying in his arms, asking forgiveness for not coming home. He thought of his mother forgiving his father even as she died alone. He thought of Edie choosing work over death presence over absence. And he thought of the land patient as stone waiting to see what he would choose. He lay down, and this time sleep came quickly, deep and dark as the well, and in his dreams he saw snow falling, 3 days away. The dream was always the same. Silas stood in the trench, knee-deep in mud that stank of death and chemicals. Artillery thundered somewhere beyond the ridge, each concussion a fist against his chest. Thomas was beside him, laughing at some joke Silas could never remember after waking. Then the whistle of the incoming shell, that distinctive shriek that meant you had 3 seconds to decide if you'd live or die. But in this version of the dream, when Silas turned to grab Thomas to pull him down into the relative safety of the dugout, it wasn't Thomas anymore. It was Edie, covered in mud, eyes wide with terror, reaching for him as the world exploded into fire and steel and screaming. He woke gasping, his shirt soaked through with sweat despite the cold room. 3 in the morning. The window showed nothing but darkness and his own pale reflection, a ghost staring back at itself. He couldn't stay in the room, couldn't lie there with his heart hammering and the phantom smell of cordite in his nostrils. He dressed quickly and went downstairs, moving through the dark house by feel and memory. Outside, the cold air hit him like a slap. Good. Real. He walked without direction, just needing to move to put distance between himself and the dream. His feet carried him toward the forest, toward the path they'd taken to the graves. He didn't realize where he was going until he stood at the entrance to the cellar, that half-hidden door behind the cabinet. It was open. A faint glow emanated from below, candlelight flickering against stone walls. Someone was down there. Silas descended the stairs slowly, placing each foot carefully on the slick stone. The air grew colder with each step, damp and mineral. At the bottom he found Nora sitting beside the well, a single candle on the ground beside her. She didn't look up when he approached. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. "I don't sleep much anymore. Haven't for years." She gestured to the space beside her. "Sit if you want." He sat his back against the stone wall. The well was a black circle in the candlelight, its surface perfectly still. Looking at it made something in his chest tighten. "What are you doing down here?" Listening, Nora said simply. "To what?" "The land. It speaks if you know how to hear it. Not in words, in feelings, images. The way your body knows a storm is coming before the sky shows signs." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Then I dreamed about the war. But it wasn't my friend who died this time. It was Edie." Nora turned to look at him, her face half in shadow. "The land is in your dreams now, showing you what you fear losing. I barely know her. You know her enough. Enough to be afraid. That's how it starts." He looked at the well. "What did you see? The first time you looked in?" Nora's expression shifted, something old and painful moving behind her eyes. "I saw my mother. She was drowning and I was holding her under." She paused. 3 months later the flood came. Killed her and my sister. And I wasn't there to save them because I'd run. Because I was in Charleston pretending I could be someone other than a keeper. That's not your fault, isn't it? If I'd stayed, if I'd accepted what I was born to be, maybe the land wouldn't have taken them. Maybe it would have been satisfied with my obedience instead of hungry for blood. Or maybe it was just a flood," Silas said. "Just water and bad timing and nothing to do with you at all." Nora smiled, sad and knowing. "You still think like a city person. Cause and effect. Logic. Coincidence. But you've felt it, haven't you? The way this place works. The way it watches, waits, responds." Silas couldn't argue. He had felt it. Every moment since he'd arrived, he'd felt something vast and patient observing him, measuring him against some standard he didn't understand. "Your father sat right where you're sitting," Nora said. 5 years ago. The last time he came back. He asked me the same questions you're asking, looked for the same logical explanations, and I told him what I'm telling you. The land doesn't care about logic. It cares about commitment. Did he commit? He tried. God knows he tried. But his heart was divided. Part of him here, part of him back in whatever life he'd built in Pittsburgh. And the land knew he was performing the covenant instead of living it. So it took and took until there was nothing left to take but his life. She stood brushing dust from her dress. "You have until midnight tonight. The land has changed its mind. It's decided to force the choice now, not in 2 days. You'll decide if you're going to split yourself in half like he did, or choose one life and live it fully. Then you'll end up like the others." Another hat night in the root cellar, the Wells Wa grave under the oak. Another story I write in my book. Another failure the land remembers. She picked up the candle and started toward the stairs, then stopped. "Edie likes you. Don't make the mistake of thinking that's simple or easy for her. She doesn't open to people. Hasn't since before I found her on that ridge with a razor in her hand. If you're going to leave, leave now, before it costs her something she can't afford to lose again." Nora climbed the stairs, taking the light with her. Silas stood in the darkness beside the well, listening to the silence. Or not silence. Beneath it he could hear something, a whisper like wind through distant trees, a pulse like a heartbeat far underground. He leaned over the well, peering into its depths. For a long moment he saw only blackness. Then slowly an image formed in the water's surface. Not a reflection. Something deeper. He saw Edie. Not as she was now, but older. Gray hair pulled back from a lined face. She was sitting on the porch, a blanket around her shoulders, staring out at the mountains. And she was alone. profoundly, devastatingly alone. The kind of alone that came from watching people leave again and again until you stopped expecting them to stay. The image shifted. Now he saw himself. But it wasn't him as he was. It was him, hollowed out, empty to shell, going through motions without meaning. He was in a city somewhere, Pittsburgh, maybe sitting in a boarding house room that looked exactly like the one he'd left. Same narrow bed, same single window, same crushing isolation. He jerked back from the well, his heart racing. The water settled to black glass again, revealing nothing. The land was showing him futures, both of them bleak, both of them wrong. Stay and watch Edie become what Nora was waiting for men who couldn't commit. Leave and become what his father was, haunted by a choice that was never really a choice at all. He climbed the stairs and emerged into the pre-dawn darkness. The house was silent. He walked to the woodpile and picked up the axe, needing the violence of splitting the clean crack of wood yielding to force. He worked as the sky lightened from black to gray to the pale blue of a November morning. Worked until his hands blistered and his shoulders screamed. Worked until he'd split enough wood to last through 2 winters, not just one. When Edie came out with coffee, he'd been at it for 2 hours. She handed him the cup without speaking, watching him with those ancient eyes. He drank, tasting nothing, then set the cup aside and lifted the axe again. "Stop," she said. "I'm not finished." "Yes, you are. You're hurting yourself. Look at your hands." He looked. Blood seeped from broken blisters mixing with dirt and wood splinters. He hadn't even felt it. Edie took the axe from him gently and set it aside. She pulled a handkerchief from her pocket and wrapped it around his right hand, then his left. Her touch was careful, professional, the touch of someone who'd treated wounds before. "You're running again," she said. He didn't deny it. She sat on the splitting block, gestured for him to sit beside her. He did, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had powered him through 2 hours of splitting drained away, leaving him hollow. "I saw you," he said. "In the well. Old and alone. Because I left." Edie was quiet for a moment. "Then I saw myself too. Years ago when Nora first brought me down there. I saw myself drowned, blue and bloated, and I thought, yes, that's right, that's what I deserve. But Nora told me something I've never forgotten. What the well shows possibilities, not certainties. It shows what might be if we choose poorly. But we can always choose differently. Can we?" Silas turned to look at her. "Or are we just following grooves worn deep by everyone who came before? My father stood where I'm standing, saw what I'm seeing, and he still ended up with a rope around his neck. He wasn't you. How do you know? How do you know I'm any different, any stronger?" Edie met his eyes. "Because you're asking questions. Your father never did. He just accepted that he was trapped and hated himself for it. But you're fighting. Even if you're fighting the wrong battle, at least you're fighting. What's the right battle? Not against the land, not against the covenant, against the fear that says you can't choose presence, can't choose connection, can't choose to stay because staying means vulnerability, and vulnerability means pain." Silas looked at his wrapped hands. The white cloth was already spotted with blood. "I watched my best friend die in France, held him while he bled out. And the worst part wasn't his dying. It was that he used his last breath to apologize, to say sorry for not making it home to his wife, like it was his fault a shell landed where it did. "I'm sorry," Edie said softly. "After that I couldn't—" He paused, searching for words. "Couldn't let anyone close. Because everyone I'd gotten close to died. My mother, Thomas, even my father in a way, though he'd already left. So I learned to not connect, not feel, just survive. And I got good at it. Good at being alone, good at not needing anyone. And now I'm here. And this place is asking me to unlearn every defense I've built, to stay when staying is hard, to connect when connecting means risk, to choose someone when choosing means I might lose them." He looked at Edie, saw the understanding in her face, the recognition of someone who'd fought the same battle. "I know," she said. "Believe me, I know. But here's what I learned. Isolation doesn't protect you from loss. It just guarantees you'll lose what matters before you ever had it." She stood, held out her hand. "Come with me. I want to show you something." He took her hand. Her palm was rough with calluses, warm despite the cold. She led him away from the house into the garden she tended through the night. It looked different in daylight. Rows of winter vegetables, kale and turnips and late carrots. Everything precise, careful, loved. "This was all dead when I came here," Edie said. "Just hard dirt and weeds. Nothing would grow." Nora said the land was grieving. Your father had just left for the third time, and the land was showing its anger the way it knows how. By withholding life. She knelt beside a row of kale, touched a leaf gently. I started digging, just to have something to do. Turned over the hard soil inch by inch. Added compost. Watered. Talked to it even though I felt insane doing it. And slowly things started to grow. Not because I was special, but because I was present. Consistent. There every day whether I felt like it or not. She looked up at Silas. The land doesn't need grand gestures. It needs dailiness. The small choice to show up again and again until showing up becomes who you are instead of what you do. That's what Nora meant, Silas said. About my father performing instead of living. Exactly. He'd come back, do everything right for a few weeks, then his guilt would eat at him and he'd leave again. On and off. Present and absent. The land can't work with that. It needs roots that go deep, and roots take time. Silas knelt beside her. Behind them the house stood solid against the gray sky. Smoke rose from the chimney. Inside Nora would be making breakfast. Dove would be sorting herbs. The dailiness Edie spoke of happening whether he was part of it or not. "Tell me about the man who hurt you," he said. Edie's hand stilled on the kale. "Why? Because I need to understand what it cost you to stay, to choose this place after what he did." She sat back on her heels. "He was my employer. I was 16 working in a textile mill in Baltimore. He was 40-something, married, respectable." She paused. "One night I was working late finishing a bolt of cloth. He came in, locked the door, and he took what he wanted because men like that believe the world owes them everything." Silas felt rage rise in his chest, hot and familiar, the same rage he'd felt watching officers send men to die for no reason, the same rage that had no outlet except inward. "When I realized I was carrying his child," Edie continued, "I tried to tell someone, but who listens to a mill girl over a factory owner? So I kept working, kept silent, and at 4 months my body made the choice. I couldn't. I bled, lost it, nearly died." She looked at Silas. "Afterward I left Baltimore. Walked. Just walked. Didn't know where I was going. Ended up here because I walked until I couldn't walk anymore. And Nora found me. Gave me a choice. Die or live. And for the first time since that night in the mill, someone was asking me to choose instead of just taking. I chose to live. Not because I wanted to, but because she asked. And then slowly the wanting came. The land didn't judge me, didn't blame me, just gave back what I gave it. Work for work, presence for presence. And that was enough to start healing." She stood brushing dirt from her knees. "So when you ask what it cost me to stay, the answer is nothing. Staying gave me back what leaving took. Purpose, daily meaning, a place where my presence matters." Silas rose beside her. "I don't know if I can do that. Be present like you are. You don't have to know yet, you just have to try. One day, then another, until the days add up to seasons, and the seasons add up to a life." They stood together in the garden, breath steaming in the cold air. And for a moment Silas felt something shift. Not a decision, not yet, but a softening. A crack in the armor he'd built around himself. Then Dove's voice cut through the morning, urgent and sharp. "The snow is coming. Tonight, not Friday." They turned. Dove stood at the edge of the garden, her pale hair whipping in a wind that had just risen. Her eyes were distant, seeing something beyond the visible. "The land is impatient," she said. "It wants an answer now." Nora appeared in the doorway, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "She's right. I can feel it. The temperature is dropping too fast. The clouds are moving in from the north. Tonight, maybe midnight, the first snow will fall. And when it does, the land will close around whatever choice you've made." Silas looked at the sky. It was pale blue, cloudless. But he could feel it too now that Dove had named it. A pressure in the air. A waiting. "I have until midnight," he said. "You have until midnight," Nora confirmed. He looked at the three women. Nora, who'd loved his father and lost everything. Edie, who'd chosen life from the edge of death. Dove, who saw what was coming and spoke it without fear. And he understood finally what the covenant really asked. Not sacrifice, not blood, just the simple, terrifying choice to stay, to be present, to let himself be known and know in return, to risk connection despite every instinct screaming that connection meant pain. He had until midnight to decide if he was brave enough, or broken in a way the land could use. The house creaked around him. Outside, the first clouds gathered, and somewhere deep in the earth something old stirred, waiting to see what choice the last thorn would make. The hours between dawn and dusk passed like water through cupped hands. Silas tried to slow them, to hold each moment long enough to examine his choice from every angle, but time refused to cooperate. The sun climbed its shallow November arc and began its descent, indifferent to human indecision. He spent the morning walking the property line, tracing the boundaries of what he'd inherited. 140 acres of forest and field, creek and stone. Land that had swallowed 7 men over 100 years and was waiting to see if he'd be the 8th. Everywhere he looked, he saw evidence of care. Fences mended with new wire. Trails cleared of fallen timber. A small bridge over the creek, its planks replaced recently, the wood still pale and unseasoned. Someone had been maintaining this place, not letting it go to ruin despite having no legal claim to it. Nora, he assumed, or Edie, or both, working through the years between his father's death and his own arrival, keeping faith with land that belonged to someone else. That should have angered him, should have felt like presumption. Instead, it humbled him. They'd cared for this place when no one asked them to, when they had every reason to walk away, when the covenant that bound them here had already taken so much. He found Edie in the afternoon harvesting the last of the root vegetables before the freeze came. She worked methodically, pulling carrots and turnips from the earth, shaking dirt from their roots, laying them in a wicker basket. Her hands moved with the same devotion he'd seen her give to everything. Nothing casual, nothing careless. "Can I help?" he asked. She glanced up, nodded toward a second basket. "Pull the turnips. Leave the tops on until we get them inside." They worked in silence for 20 minutes. The soil was cold and damp, clinging to everything it touched. Silas's wrapped hands ached, the broken blisters protesting every grip, every pull. He didn't stop. Finally, Edie spoke. "Have you decided no? Will you know by midnight? I don't know." He pulled a particularly stubborn turnip, stumbling slightly when it finally gave. "How did you know?" "When you chose to stay." "How did you know it was right?" Edie sat back on her heels, considering. "I didn't. Not at first. I just knew I was tired of running, tired of waking up in places that didn't know my name, tired of being a ghost in my own life. So I stayed because staying was different from what I'd always done, and different felt like the only choice left. But at some point it must have shifted, from staying because you had nowhere else to go to, staying because you wanted to." "Yes," she said softly. "That shift happened, but not all at once, not in some grand moment of clarity. It was gradual. One morning I woke up and realized I'd been thinking about the spring planting, planning ahead, assuming I'd still be here in 6 months. And I was surprised by that assumption, surprised that somewhere along the way this place had become my future instead of just my present." She pulled another carrot, examined it, added it to her basket. "The land doesn't demand you know everything at once. It just asks you to not run, to be here tomorrow, and then the day after, and eventually those tomorrows pile up into something that looks like a life." Silas wanted to believe her, wanted to believe it could be that simple, but his mind kept circling back to his father, to the rope, to all the ways choosing this place had destroyed the men who'd come before. "What if I'm like him?" he asked quietly. "What if I say yes tonight and then spend the next 20 years wishing I'd said no?" "Then you'll have company in your misery," Edie said. "We all have days we wish we'd chosen differently. Days the isolation feels crushing. Days we remember the world beyond these ridges and wonder what we gave up. But those days pass, and underneath them is something steadier, something worth the cost." She stood brushing dirt from her knees. "But I won't lie to you, Silas. This life is hard. The winters are brutal. The summers are short. You'll work until your body aches and wake up to do it again. You'll watch storms tear apart what you've built and have to rebuild it. You'll be lonely sometimes even with 3 other people in the house. If you're looking for easy, you won't find it here. What will I find? Purpose," she said simply. "The kind that doesn't need explaining. The kind you feel in your bones when you wake up. And for some people, that's enough. Is it enough for you? Most days. And the days it's not. Then I go to the garden and dig until my hands bleed. Because even on the days I hate this place, I hate the alternative more." She picked up her basket. "Dinner's at 6. After that, the evening is yours. To walk, to think, to decide. But at midnight, one way or another, the choice gets made, with you or without you." She walked back toward the house, leaving Silas alone in the garden with a half-full basket and a mind that wouldn't settle. He finished pulling the turnips, then sat in the dirt beside the empty rows. Above, the sky had begun to change. Clouds moving in from the north, exactly as Dove had predicted. They weren't snow clouds yet, but they would be. He could feel it in the air, that electric waiting before a storm. A sound made him turn. Dove stood at the edge of the garden, so still he might have mistaken her for a scarecrow if not for her eyes. They fixed on him with unnerving intensity. "You're afraid of the wrong thing," she said. "What am I afraid of? Staying. But you should be afraid of leaving." "Why?" "Because if you leave, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering. You'll see this place in every dream, taste it in every drink of water, feel its absence like a missing limb. Your father left 3 times and it broke him a little more each time. Not because the land cursed him, because he cursed himself." Dove moved closer, her feet making no sound on the earth. "The land doesn't punish people for leaving, it just stops protecting them. And the world is very hard without protection." "What kind of protection?" She knelt beside him, placed her palm flat on the soil. "This ground remembers you now, knows your weight, your scent, the rhythm of your breathing. If you stay, it will hold you, keep you safe in ways you can't understand yet. But if you go alone, truly alone, the kind of alone that makes cities feel like graveyards." "How do you know?" Silas asked. "Have you ever tried to leave once? When I was 17, I made it as far as the train station in Coal Creek, bought a ticket to Richmond, sat on the platform for 3 hours waiting for the train. But every time I tried to stand to walk to the platform edge, my legs wouldn't work. Not because of the land, because of me, because I knew bone deep that leaving meant dying. And you never tried again." "Never wanted to." The knowing settled something in me, made the choice clear. I'm not here because I'm trapped. I'm here because everywhere else is the trap. She stood, brushed invisible dust from her dress. "At 11:30, come to the well. All of you. There's something you need to see before midnight." "What?" "The truth. The part Nora hasn't told you yet. The part your father never understood." She walked away, disappearing into the lengthening shadows. Dinner was quiet. They ate stew and bread, the food sitting heavy in Silas's stomach. No one mentioned the snow or the deadline or the choice. They talked about small things, the hinges on the barn door that needed replacing, the fox that had been raiding the chicken coop, whether to plant more potatoes next spring or try something new. The domesticity of it struck Silas. These women planning a future they had no guarantee of, planning as if he'd already chosen, as if his presence come spring was certain. It should have felt like pressure. Instead, it felt like faith. After dinner, he went to his room, sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out the small wooden box he'd carried from Pittsburgh, opened it again. The lock of hair, the tiny tooth, the letter from his mother. He read the letter one more time by lamplight. Choose presence over fear. Choose staying over running. It's the only way to break what we couldn't. His mother had known. Known that his father was destroying himself by trying to live in two worlds. Known that the only salvation was commitment. And still she'd refused to come here with him. Refused out of fear. And in choosing her fear over his need, she'd condemned them both. Silas didn't want to repeat that mistake. Didn't want to die alone in some boarding house whispering apologies to ghosts. But he also didn't want to end up like his father, present in body, but absent in spirit, going through motions until the motions became a noose. At 11:15 he descended the stairs. Nora and Edie were already waiting, wrapped in heavy coats. Dove stood by the door holding a lantern. "Time," Dove said simply. They walked through the dark to the cellar entrance. The temperature had dropped dramatically. Silas's breath came in thick clouds. Above, the first stars were disappearing behind advancing clouds. Down in the cellar, Nora lit candles around the well. The flickering light threw shadows that seemed alive, dancing on the stone walls. All four of them stood around the circle of stones, looking down into the black water. "Before you choose," Nora said, "you need to understand what the covenant really is. What it's always been." She pulled a folded paper from her pocket. Old, brittle. Carefully she unfolded it on the stone rim of the well. "This is the original covenant, written in 1823 by your ancestor Jeremiah Thorne and the Cherokee medicine woman whose land he bought. But it's not what you think it is." Silas leaned closer. The handwriting was archaic, hard to read. But certain phrases stood out. In exchange for stewardship of sacred ground, one keeper per generation to hold the memory. Not ownership, but partnership. Blood given freely, not taken. "Blood," Silas said. "It does ask for blood." "Not death blood," Edie said. "Life blood. Presence. Commitment. The willingness to bleed into this soil through work, through care, through staying when staying is hard. Your ancestors misunderstood, thought it meant sacrifice, thought someone had to die. But that was their guilt speaking, not the land's demand." Dove gestured to the well. "Look again. Truly look. See what's really there." Silas leaned over the rim. The water was perfectly still. For a long moment he saw only darkness. Then slowly light began to bloom in the depths. Not reflected light. Its own light rising from below. Images formed. Not single scenes, but a cascade overlapping, flowing into and out of each other. He saw the Cherokee woman, ancient and knowing, placing her hand on Jeremiah Thorne's head. Not cursing him, blessing him, making him steward instead of owner. He saw the first keeper, that boy from the photograph, not sacrificed but chosen. Trained. Taught to listen to the land, to speak for it, to hold its memory. He saw generations of keepers, some successful, some failing. But the failures he saw now weren't because the land was cruel. They failed because they fought, because they tried to bend the covenant to their will instead of bending themselves to its truth. He saw his father. Saw the moment Nathaniel Thorne stood where Silas stood, now looking into this same well. Saw the fear in his eyes, the division, the desperate wish to serve two masters, and he saw the land's response. Not anger, sadness, the deep sorrow of something ancient watching another human choose isolation over connection. The images shifted one last time, then stopped. The water's surface went black, still, too still. Then it erupted, not with violence but with presence. The water didn't splash or overflow, it simply parted, and from the depths a figure rose. She emerged slowly, impossibly, standing now at the well's edge, as if she'd been there all along. A woman older than memory itself. Her form was solid yet translucent, like looking through smoke-made flesh. Her hair moved, though the air was perfectly still. Her eyes were not eyes, but hollows filled with starlight and ancient sorrow. Silas stumbled backward. His shoulder hit stone. Beside him, Nora, Edie, and Dove stood perfectly motionless, heads bowed as if in the presence of something holy. The woman turned her gaze to Silas. When she looked at him, he felt seen in a way that went deeper than sight. Seen through, known, measured. Her mouth didn't move, but her voice filled the cellar like wind through stone, like water over rocks, like the first words ever spoken. I do not ask for your death. I ask for your life. Not the easy parts, not the performance, all of it. Fear and strength, doubt and faith. The days you love me and the days you curse me. Give me your wholeness and I will give you mine. That is the covenant. That is all it has ever been. She raised one hand, placed it over the space where her heart should be, then placed it over the space where Silas's heart was, though 20 feet separated them. He felt the touch, warm, real, undeniable. Then she was gone, not fading, not dissolving, simply ceasing to exist as if she'd never been there at all. Only the ripples on the water remained as evidence. Silas couldn't breathe, couldn't move. His legs gave out and he sank to his knees. "What?" His voice cracked. "Who was that?" Dove spoke barely above a whisper. "The first keeper's mother. The Cherokee woman who made the covenant. She comes only once, when the choice must be made." "She was real," Silas said. "Not a question, a statement." "As real as the land itself," Nora said quietly. "The land remembers her, holds her, and when a thorn stands at the crossroads she returns, to remind, to witness." Edie knelt beside Silas, her hand on his shoulder. "Did you feel it, when she touched you?" Silas nodded, unable to speak. His chest still burned where her phantom hand had rested. "That's how you know it's real," Edie said. "That's how you know this isn't madness, and the thing your father saw but couldn't accept. The land isn't a curse, it's an offer, a partnership, but partnership requires vulnerability, requires showing up as you are, not as you wish you were, and most men can't do that, can't surrender control enough to receive what's offered." Silas looked at the 3 women, at Nora who'd lost everything and chosen to stay anyway, at Edie who'd transformed trauma into tenderness through dirt and daily work, at Dove who'd seen the truth so clearly she'd never needed to run from it. They'd all made the choice he was facing, and they'd all survived it. More than survived. Become themselves in ways that weren't possible anywhere else. The cellar was silent except for the drip of water somewhere in the stone. Above them the first snowflakes began to fall. Silas could hear them landing on the ground outside, soft as whispers. "It's midnight," Dove said quietly. Silas closed his eyes, felt the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. His father's abandonment, his mother's death, the war, Thomas bleeding out in French mud, Claire dying in a car he'd been driving. Every loss, every leaving, every moment he'd chosen safety over presence. And he felt something else, the soil of the garden under his fingernails, the ache of honest work in his shoulders, the warmth of Edie's hand when she'd bandaged his, the sound of Nora's voice reading in the kitchen, the strange comfort of Dove's unblinking certainty. He thought of the vision in the well, the ancient woman made of earth. "I ask for your life." He opened his eyes. "I'll stay," he said. The words hung in the cold air. Simple, irrevocable. For the 3 seasons, Nora asked. "Through winter and into spring?" "No," Silas said. He met her eyes. "Not for 3 seasons. For as long as it takes. For as long as I'm needed. For as long as this is home." Edie's hand found his in the darkness, squeezed once. Dove smiled a rare and genuine expression. "The land heard you." And it had. Silas could feel it. A subtle shift in the air. A release of tension he hadn't known was there. Above them the snow fell heavier now, blanketing the world in white, erasing old paths, making everything new. They climbed the stairs together, emerging into a world transformed. Snow already covered the ground, muffling sound, softening edges. The house glowed with lamplight, warm and welcoming. Inside, Nora poured whiskey into 4 glasses. "A toast," she said, "to the first Thorn man in 100 years who chose presence over fear." They drank. The whiskey burned, going down, warming Silas from the inside out. Edie set down her glass. "You should know something. Staying doesn't mean it gets easier. The work is still hard. The winters still brutal. The isolation still real." "I know," Silas said. But she continued, her eyes soft. "You won't carry it alone anymore." "No," he agreed. "I won't." They sat together as the snow piled against the windows. Tomorrow would bring work. Wood to split animals, to tend paths to clear. Tomorrow would bring all the small, difficult tasks that made up a life committed to place. But tonight there was only this: 4 people around a table, the warmth of the fire, the knowledge that come morning they'd all still be here. Silas had finally come home, and this time he was staying. The snow fell for 3 days straight. Silas woke on the first morning to a world remade in white. Drifts climbed halfway up the porch railings. The oak tree stood transformed, its massive branches bowed under the weight of snow, creaking in the wind like the rigging of a ship. Everything was silent in the way only deep snow can make silent, as if the land itself had drawn a breath and forgotten to release it. He dressed quickly in the cold room and went downstairs. Found Nora already at the stove making coffee. She glanced at him, nodded toward the window. 2 feet, she said. "More coming. We'll be snowed in for a week at least." "Is that normal for November?" She poured coffee into 2 cups, handed him one. "Nothing about this place is normal. But yes, the first snow after a keeper chooses it always comes hard. Like the land is testing the commitment, seeing if you'll panic when you realize there's no leaving now, even if you wanted to." "I don't want to," Silas said. "I know. I can see it in you. Different than yesterday. Settled." He drank the coffee, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. "What needs doing?" "Everything," Nora said with a slight smile. "Animals need feeding. Paths need clearing. Firewood needs bringing in. Water needs hauling. Welcome to winter at Thornwood Ridge." They worked through the morning, all 4 of them moving in practiced rhythms. Silas followed Edie to the barn, learning the routine of feeding chickens and the 2 goats they kept for milk. The barn was warmer than outside, but still cold enough to see breath. The animals were calm, used to the snow, unbothered by the storm. Edie showed him how much feed each animal needed, where the tools were kept, how to check the water troughs for ice. She moved efficiently, no wasted motion, explaining as she worked. Silas watched and learned, committing it all to memory. "You'll do this alone sometimes," she said. "When I'm working the garden or Nora's in town or Dove's gathering. Everyone needs to know everything here. No room for specialization when you're this isolated." "I understand." She paused in spreading hay, looked at him. "Do you really? Because yesterday you were a lawyer from the city. Today you're a farmer on a cursed mountain. That's a hell of a shift to make in one night." "I've made bigger shifts," Silas said. "From civilian to soldier took less than a week. From living to surviving took about 3 seconds. This," he gestured around the barn, "feels more like shifting back to something I should have been all along." Edie studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. Because the land doesn't tolerate pretending. It'll know if you're playing at this, and it'll respond accordingly." "What does that mean?" "It means if your heart's not in it, things will start to go wrong. Small at first. Tools breaking. Animals getting sick. Then bigger. Storms at the wrong times. Crops failing. The land gives back what you give it. Presents for presents. Half measures for half measures. Then I'll give it whole measures," Silas said. They worked in silence after that, the kind of silence that felt comfortable rather than awkward. When the barn work was finished, they returned to the house for lunch. Simple fare bread and cheese and apples from the root cellar. But it tasted better than any meal Silas could remember. Maybe because he'd earned it. Maybe because he was sharing it with people who knew his name and expected him to still be there tomorrow. After lunch, Nora taught him how to bank the fire properly for overnight, how to read the damper to control the heat where the best seasoned wood was stacked. Dove showed him which herbs were for cooking and which were for medicine, made him repeat the names until he had them memorized. By evening, Silas's body ached in new places. Good aches, work aches, the kind that came from using muscles for their intended purpose rather than just carrying tension. He sat on the porch after dinner, wrapped in a heavy coat, watching snow fall through the lamplight. The world beyond the porch was invisible, just swirling white in darkness. He should have felt trapped. Instead, he felt held. The door opened behind him. Edie stepped out, her own coat pulled tight, and sat beside him on the wooden bench. "You'll freeze out here," she said. "So will you. Then we'll freeze together." They sat in silence, watching the snow. After a while, Edie spoke. "I need to tell you something. About your brother. About what really happened." Silas turned to her. "Nora said he died of winter sickness. That's what we told your father. What Nora told herself. But I was here. I saw." She paused, choosing words carefully. "The baby didn't die of sickness. He died of rejection." "What do you mean?" Edie pulled her coat tighter. "Your father stayed that winter, tried to do right, but he was miserable, openly, obviously miserable, pacing at night, staring at the road, talking about Pittsburgh, about your mother, about the life he'd left behind. And Nora, she loved him so much it was painful to watch. Kept trying harder, kept giving more, kept hoping he'd see her, really see her, instead of just tolerating her presence. The baby was born in January, healthy, strong lungs. He should have thrived, but within days he started failing. Wouldn't nurse, wouldn't sleep, just cried and cried, like he could feel his father's rejection in the air. And the land." Edie's voice dropped. "The land felt it too, the grudging presence, the resentful obligation, and it withdrew its protection from the child. So the land killed him. No, the land just stopped keeping him alive. There's a difference. A subtle one maybe, but real. The baby died because he was born into a covenant his father didn't mean, into a promise that was a lie." Silas felt sick. "My father killed his own son by not loving his mother. Not just that, by not loving this place, by treating it like a prison instead of a home. The land doesn't demand romantic love between keepers and the women here. It demands authentic presence, genuine commitment. Your father couldn't give that, so the covenant rejected his offering. Does Nora know that it was his fault? She knows. She's always known. That's why his suicide broke her the way it did, because part of her had been waiting 20 years for him to understand what he'd done, to come back and make it right. But he never understood, never let himself see it, just kept running and coming back and running again until running was all he knew how to do." Edie stood. "I'm telling you this because you need to know what's at stake. You chose to stay last night. That was the first step. But the real choice happens every morning when you wake up. Every moment you're tempted to resent this place, to wish you were somewhere else, to phone in the work instead of meaning it. Those moments matter, maybe more than the big dramatic choice." She went inside, leaving Silas alone with the snow and the weight of understanding. He sat there for another hour, letting himself feel the full measure of what he'd inherited. Not just land, not just a house, but a web of grief and loss and failed attempts at presence stretching back 100 years. 7 men who'd stood where he stood, 7 different ways of failing, and 1 infant who'd paid the price for his father's divided heart. When he finally went inside, he found his way to his father's room. Stood in the doorway, looking at the bed where Nathaniel Thorne had slept, the desk, where he'd written that desperate note, the window he'd looked out while his son died downstairs. "I'm sorry," Silas said to the empty room. "Sorry you couldn't figure it out. Sorry you let fear make you cruel. Sorry you died thinking you were trapped when really you were just afraid to be free." He closed the door and went to his own room, lay in the narrow bed and listened to the house settle around him. Footsteps above, the crack of the cooling stove, wind pressing snow against the windows. And for the first time since France, he slept without dreaming of death. The snow stopped on the 4th day. The world emerged into brilliant sunshine, everything diamond bright and almost painful to look at. Silas helped dig out pathways, learning the rhythm of shoveling the way to lift without straining his back, how to read the drift patterns to know where digging would be easiest. By afternoon they'd cleared paths to the barn, the woodshed, and the well house. The work left Silas exhausted but satisfied. Real work. Necessary work. Work that mattered in immediate, tangible ways. That evening Nora pulled him aside after dinner. "Walk with me," she said. They bundled into coats and went out into the blue twilight. The snow crunched under their boots, the sound sharp in the cold air. Nora led him away from the house toward the forest edge. "I want to show you something," she said. "Something I haven't shown anyone in a long time." They walked for 10 minutes, following what must have been a path under the snow until they reached a small clearing. In its center stood a structure Silas hadn't seen before, a cabin barely more than a shed, its roof sagging under snow weight. This was the original house, Nora said, built in 1823 when Jeremiah first claimed the land. The big house came later in the 1850s. But this is where it all started. She pushed open the door. Inside was a single room, maybe 12 feet square. A stone fireplace, rough plank floors, one small window, everything covered in dust and mouse droppings and the evidence of long neglect. "I come here sometimes," Nora said, "when I need to remember why this matters. When the work feels endless and the isolation crushes and I forget why I stay." She moved to the fireplace, ran her hand along the mantel. "There's writing here, carved into the stone." "Want to see?" Silas moved closer. By the fading light he could just make out letters carved deep into the rock. "Here we plant what was taken. Here we grow what was stolen. May those who tend remember what was lost." The Cherokee woman's words, Nora said. She carved them herself before she died. A reminder that this was never about ownership. It was always about restoration, about returning care to land that had been violated by greed. Silas traced the letters with his finger, felt the depth of them, the work it must have taken to carve them. "Your ancestors never understood this," Nora continued. "They thought the covenant was a burden, a curse, but it was an opportunity, a chance to heal what their presence had broken, to give back what their arrival had taken. 7 men couldn't see that, couldn't see past their own resentment and fear. And you think I can? I think you already have. You chose presence knowing it would be hard. That's more than any of them ever did." She moved to the window, looked out at the darkening forest. "I loved your father, Silas, truly loved him. Not because the land told me to, not because of the covenant, but because in the brief moments when he let his guard down, I could see who he might have been if fear hadn't claimed him. Funny, tender, curious about the world. But those moments got rarer each time he came back, until there was nothing left but guilt walking in his shape." "I won't be him," Silas said. "No, you won't, because you've already made a different choice. You saw the same vision he saw in the well, felt the same fear, stood at the same crossroads. But you chose differently, chose to see the offer instead of the trap." She turned from the window. "There's something else you should know, about me and Edie and Dove. We're not prisoners here. We could leave if we wanted. The covenant doesn't bind us the way it binds the Thorn men. We stay because we choose to. Every single day, we choose to." "Then why do you need me?" Silas asked. "If you can maintain the place yourselves, if the land responds to your care, why does there need to be a male keeper at all?" Nora smiled sadly. "Because the covenant was made with your ancestor, with his line. The land remembers agreements. We can tend it, love it, work it. But we can't complete the circle without a thorn choosing to return, choosing to stay. That's the missing piece, the thing that makes the land whole again. So I'm here to fix what was broken." "No. You're here to witness that it's being fixed, to participate in the healing instead of the taking. Your presence closes the wound, makes the circle complete. Without it, the land stays partially broken no matter how much we give." They walked back to the house in darkness, the snow glowing faintly under a rising moon. When they reached the porch, Nora stopped. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for choosing us, for choosing this, for being brave enough to stay when running would have been easier." "Thank you for waiting," Silas replied, "for keeping faith when you had every reason not to." Inside, Edie and Dove were sitting by the fire mending clothes, They looked up when Silas and Nora entered, and something passed between the four of them. An understanding. A recognition that they were no longer three women and a man, but something more integrated. A household. A family, perhaps, though not in any traditional sense. Silas sat with them, picked up a shirt that needed buttons replaced, and threaded a needle. His fingers were clumsy at first, unused to the small work, but Edie showed him how to anchor the thread, how to pass the needle through, how to make the stitches small and even. They worked in comfortable silence until the fire burned low. Then, one by one, they went to their rooms. Silas climbed the stairs, no longer thinking of his narrow bed as temporary. It was his bed now. This was his room, his house, his land, his covenant to keep. He looked out the window one last time before sleeping. The snow had settled into a thick blanket over everything, smoothing rough edges, making the familiar strange and the strange beautiful. Tomorrow the work would continue, and the day after, and the day after that. Days adding up to seasons, adding up to a life. But tonight there was only this, the quiet house, the sleeping land. And for the first time since his mother had died, Silas Thorne felt at peace. He was home, and he was staying. April 1924. Spring arrived on a Tuesday morning, not with fanfare, but with the sound of ice cracking on the creek. Silas stood at the edge of the field he'd cleared over winter, a spade in his hands, watching steam rise from the turned earth. 4 months since the snow had fallen. 4 months since he'd spoken 3 words that changed everything. "I'll stay." His body had changed. Shoulders broader from splitting wood, hands calloused from working soil. The hollow look gone from his eyes, replaced by something steadier. Not happiness exactly, but presence, purpose, the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered in immediate, tangible ways. Behind him, footsteps. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. He'd learned the rhythm of her walk, the particular way she moved through space, efficient and unhurried. Edie stopped beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. She didn't speak immediately, just stood there looking out at what they'd built together. The garden rose, marked and ready for planting. The chicken coop he'd repaired, the fence line they'd mended. Then she took his hand, placed it on her belly. Silas's breath caught. The swell was small, barely visible beneath her dress, but undeniable beneath his palm. Life, growing, real. When his voice came out rough. October, maybe November. Edie looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd known her, she smiled fully. No guardedness, no sorrow lurking at the edges, just pure, uncomplicated joy. "Dove says it's a boy. Says he'll have your eyes and my stubbornness." Silas pulled her close, pressing his face into her hair. It smelled of wood smoke, and the lavender soap Nora made smelled like home. "The land will protect him," Edie whispered, "because you meant it, when you chose to stay. The covenant knows the difference." Over her shoulder, Silas could see the house. Nora, hanging laundry on the line, singing something in a language he didn't recognize. Cherokee, maybe, or something older. Dove emerged from the forest basket full of early greens, her pale hair catching sunlight. This was his family now. Not the one he'd been born into, the one he'd chosen, the one that had chosen him back. "I went to the well last night," Silas said quietly. Edie stiffened slightly in his arms. "Why?" "I needed to see." "See what?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I saw us, old, gray-haired, sitting on that porch 40 years from now, grandchildren playing under the oak tree. And we were smiling." Edie's hand found his, laced their fingers together. "That's a good vision." "Yes," Silas agreed, "it is." A bird called from the forest. The creek rushed with snowmelt, and beneath their feet the land hummed its approval. Not hungrily, not demandingly, just satisfied. For the first time in 100 years, Thornwood Ridge had a keeper who would stay. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. Silas thought of his father, of the rope, of all the men who'd stood where he stood and made the wrong choice. But their failures weren't his destiny. Their fear wasn't his inheritance. He'd chosen differently, and that made all the difference. "Come on," Edie said, tugging his hand. "Nora's making stew, and Dove says if we're late she's eating our portions." Silas laughed. Actually laughed. The sound surprised him. How long had it been since he'd laughed? Since Thomas died? Longer. They walked back to the house together, hand in hand, the spring sun warm on their backs. At the porch, Nora looked up from her laundry and smiled. Dove nodded once as if confirming something only she could see. Inside, the fire crackled. Bread cooled on the counter. The table was set for 4. No, not 4. Silas counted again. 5 places. 5 plates. Edie saw him notice, squeezed his hand. Dove said it. Said we need to start getting used to 5. 5. Because in 6 months there would be 5. Silas sat at the table. His table. In his house. On his land. Surrounded by his family. And for the first time since the train had pulled into Coal Creek Station 5 months ago, Silas Thorne felt something he thought he'd lost in a French trench covered in mud and blood. Hope. That night in the root cellar, the well's water ran clear and still, and if you looked closely, which no one did because no one needed to anymore, you might see faint golden light rising from its depths. Not foreboding, not hungry. Just the gentle glow of something ancient finally allowed to rest.